how are we? I promised today to continue our work on evolutionary ethics and social Darwinism, and so we'll at least start right there. But before we get involved in that, I want to retrogress a little bit, because I had mentioned a book before in this class, which was a book on evolution published by a very religious person several years before Darwin. And that was a book entitled The Vestiges of Creation, or The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Now, this book was published anonymously. Can we get the people on in West Houston? See if they're there. The book on the vestiges of the natural history of creation was written anonymously. And we may talk more about the author who was ultimately discovered later. But the important thing about this book is the copy that I have, that I Xeroxed this from, was published in 1853. Well, obviously then, there were people, this underscores the fact that we were talking about, that there were lots of people before Darwin who were thinking in terms of evolution. And most of these people were religious people. Darwin himself was a religious person. But I just want to read from the preface of this 10th edition of 1853, 10th edition, to show what the motivation was for this man to write a book on evolution. The author of this work, a private person with limited opportunities of study, and of course Darwin liked to point that out as he criticized this book, but at the same, because Darwin was very critical of this book, because obviously he missed the true interpretation of evolution. But that's not my reason for bringing him up. My reason for bringing him up is whether he got the true interpretation of evolution or not. Obviously, if Darwin got it, then he didn't. He still was interested in the subject enough to brave writing a book in which he put forth the theory of evolution on religious grounds. The author of this work first had his attention attracted to the early history of animated nature on becoming acquainted with an outline of the Laplacian hypothesis of the solar system. Having previously been convinced that the divine governor, capital D, capital G, of the world conducts its passing affairs by a fixed rule, to which we apply the term natural law, he was much impressed on finding reason to believe that the physical arrangements of the universe had been originated in the same manner, as it seemed to him to favor the idea of a perfect unity in the action of the one eternal and infinite, capital O, capital E, capital I. After this point was attained, he was not long in perceiving that the commencement of life and organization was very unsatisfactorily accounted for by fiat. In other words, by special creation. So he's not any more satisfied with special creation, and this is already in the 1840s. He's not satisfied with special creation by fiat any more than Darwin came to be. In fact, he was dissatisfied with it before Darwin was. So these changes in the commencement of life and its organization was very unsatisfactorily accounted for by fiats, special miracles, interferences, and other suggestions and figures of speech in vogue amongst geologists. It seemed to him logically necessary that we should regard the organic part of nature as having been instituted in the manner of law also, though not less under the providential care of the Supreme, with a capital S, than the physical phenomenon of the beginning, and any part of the great pageant of nature which daily passes before our eyes and in which we ourselves have a place. Then he goes on to talk about the hypothesis of Lamarck. But he critiques Lamarck's concept of evolution. But again, what I want to underline here is that this man has primarily a religious or theological motivation for putting forth a theory of evolution. It's not that he has given up belief in God and become an agnostic, so now he has to try to find some other way of understanding it. From his perspective, the young earth theory and the idea of fiat special creation was simply unsatisfactory. And he therefore obviously didn't assume that it was not necessary to be an Orthodox Christian to believe those kinds of things. So that is from the Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. I don't know if we have a copy of that in the library. I had been looking for it for about 15 years and found one last year, I think, in Colorado. Now we turn on our screen to evolutionary ethics and social Darwinism. In the Victorian era, the idea of evolutionary progress became a secular substitute for providence. Not blind fate, but a beneficent cosmic process governs our future and guarantees the final fruition of history and even human perfection. Now, what we want to see is that this is the evolutionism that attached itself to Darwin, even though Darwin provides no evidence or basis for this evolutionism. In other words, if you're out here in the field in the Victorian era of intellectuals, you're already overwhelmed by evolutionists. The question is there a scientific basis for evolution? And some of these folks had already ventured to guess that there might be, and Lamarck had already done his work. The author of the Vestiges had done his work anonymously, and Wallace was already working. But there were also already people working philosophically on evolution. And they had already come to the view that evolution was a beneficent process. That is, it was a progressive process that eventually made everything better and better as it went along. Well, can you see why Darwin would not want his scientific theory confused with this concept of evolution? Somebody just lay it out for me. Darwin had a little bit of a leaning toward progress, but he thought that these guys were just misunderstanding his thing altogether.
Well, to me at least, it seems like it's almost a separate religion. I mean, some type of beneficent creator working in a completely different way than his Christian doctrine.
Yeah. It's the predecessor. In fact, it's proto-modernism. That is, it's the belief that the old traditional ways in which the church had understood the nature of the human being and the nature of history and the nature of the Christian religion were just a little too old and a little out of date. Whenever people decide to become modern, interestingly enough, they always shift to being pantheists. Even a great deal of what is called New Age today, it's labeled New Age, but there's nothing new about it. It's the revival of pantheism. It's the revival of the view that whatever God is, he is inherent in the process, and that, as a matter of fact, we ourselves are a part of God, who have simply been kind of dislodged as a little piece and are now trapped in physical existence. Well, these people were more optimistic about nature and about history than New Age people, but they still tended toward a pantheism, which means a complete immanence of God, as opposed to any transcendence of God. That God was somehow in the process. We don't know how he's in the process, but here comes Darwin, and he's done us the favor of showing us how he's in the process. And Darwin says, no, that is not what I've done. And particularly Huxley says that. Beneficent is a word that Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and people like this despise if it's used in relation to Darwinism or in relation to the scientific theory of evolution. Beneficent, they can't find anything beneficent in the scientific theory of evolution. So it makes it difficult for them, I guess, to understand how these totally optimistic, divine, immanent philosophers could confuse what they were doing with Darwin. So progress became a secular substitute for providence. It not only became a secular substitute for providence, but it became a secular substitute for Christian eschatology. Now we're going to have to look at that word, especially as we get along toward the end, because a great many Christians in modern theology who accept Darwinism put it together with an eschatology, not a concept of progress, but an eschatology. The concept of progress in the 19th century also not only took the place of providence, which is God's providing care to make sure everything turns out all right, which was not all that optimistic. The concept of providence is not all that optimistic about history, because the concept of progress is based on the Christian eschaton, the Christian eschatological idea that human beings are not going to make God's world the way it should be. Human beings cannot bring in the kingdom of God. So the kingdom of God, at least in the biblical faith, was a extravagant inbreaking of God from outside into the historical process to change history. Whereas progress is the idea that God doesn't have to make this radical inbreaking from outside to change history. He's already put the seeds of the historical change within the evolutionary process itself. Now, the amazing thing is that people in the 19th century used the word evolution for this and Darwinism at the same time, and sometimes confused the two. Not only, and most of these people were religious people, but they tended to be pantheists, though they may not have even used that term. So what is eschatology? Well, Christian eschatology comes from the Greek word eschaton, which simply means that there is an end. There was a beginning, there will be an end, and everything in between is a unique event that has never happened before, and so forth. In other words, eschaton is the other boot of creation. It's the other bookend. If you know in Christianity what the meaning of creation is, then you also know by extrapolation what the meaning of the eschaton is, because the eschaton will be the cleaning up of creation and making it into what it was originally intended to be. So if bodily existence is good in the creation, the fact that bodily existence has gotten so messed up in the meantime means that in the eschaton, bodily existence in effect will be cleaned up, and we will be bodily people, bodily beings of the kind that God originally intended us to be. That's the significance of the idea of the incarnation, in which God himself becomes flesh and dwells among us. That's the significance of the Christian doctrine of the resurrection, in that Christ didn't die and his immortal soul popped up to heaven. That wasn't Christian thought. That wasn't Jewish thought. Christ died and was dead. That seems like a simple idea, but it's an idea that has been covered up throughout Christian history by Neoplatonic ideas of the soul. So according to the New Testament, Christ died and was dead. Now if Christ is dead, what's it going to take to get him undead? It's going to take resurrection. It's going to take an inbreaking from God from the outside to defeat death, to overcome death. So from the early Christian perspective, the same thing, if that had to happen in order for Jesus to be raised from the dead, then that obviously is also going to have to happen in order for us to be raised from the dead. And by being raised from the dead, they're meaning that we're raised to be, in the end, what God originally intended us to be in the beginning. So that's in very short form, the idea of Christian eschatology. Eschatology in Christianity doesn't just mean where you're going when you die, whether you're going to heaven or hell when you die. It means how you understand life now. Whether you understand life now as good, whether you understand life in history as good, whether you understand life as an individual bodily person as good. That depends on your eschatology. Well, eschatology is linear. Eschatology has a beginning, it will have an end. The tree of life, you remember, we were reading Genesis, was planted in the Garden of Eden. But because the people ate the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life is barred. They're barred from being able to eat of the tree of life. That's what the cherubim are doing at the gate, keeping people out of the Garden of Eden so they can't eat of the tree of life. Well, does that mean that human beings have ultimately and completely lost the tree of life? No, the tree of life has been replanted. The tree of life is replanted in the new heavens and the new earth, which will be the eschatological outcome of human history. But it's linear. It's brought about by God. It's not inevitable progress. Well, by the time you get to the Middle Ages, now this may be complicated for you to get with one pass, so we'll probably have to talk about it a little more. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, instead of eschatology, the church became more interested in hierarchy. That's even manifested in the organization of the church, that the church became manifested in hierarchy. Well, you get eschatology from the New Testament. Where do you get hierarchy of being? From Aristotle. And Aristotle, being gets better and better as it goes toward the top. The soul gets fuller and fuller as it gets toward the top. So the top human being, the philosopher king, according to Plato, is the epitome of what it really means to have soul. I mean, he's got it all. As you go down the ladder of the hierarchy of being, you have less and less soul. And finally, you drop out of human being and you get into animal being, and animals have less soul than humans, and some animals have less soul than other animals. Then you drop out of the animal kingdom into the vegetable kingdom. Vegetables have less soul than animals. You drop out of the vegetable kingdom into the material kingdom, or the kingdom of solid matter. And solid matter has soul, but it has less soul than vegetables. So this is the hierarchical view of reality. And medieval religion became hierarchical instead of eschatological. That is, the eschatological, you will study this if you ever take the course in Christianity. The eschatological vision of the New Testament church didn't just fade away, it was transmuted into a hierarchical view. Okay? So you've got the setup right here for the idea of progress. Now, are you looking at let's look at the setup again. You've got the setup for the idea of progress. Because if you were a 18th and 19th century kind of Enlightenment type, you have already been influenced by Christian eschatology, even though you may not even know what the word means. You've already been influenced by the idea that there is kind of a linear aspect of history. But you've also been influenced by the hierarchical view that as you go up, you get better and better. So what happens is the hierarchical view in the Enlightenment leans over and becomes almost fused with the eschatological view. And so Christian eschatology on the part of these modernists becomes the idea of progress. Now, did you follow that? Did you follow that? Whereas Christian eschatology was not necessarily optimistic about progress. It believed that the only progress that could take place had to come from the outside by the activity of God. The hierarchical view that as you get farther up the ladder of being, you get better and better, is fused after the Enlightenment with the eschatology of Christianity. So Christian eschatology then becomes optimistic and progressive, so that the world is getting better and better. This is the source of what is called post-millennialism. That is, and we're getting into some words that are going to cause us problems, but we all know what the millennium is. It just means 1,000 years, and the 1,000 years in which Christ reigns is understood in several different ways by Christians. The premillennial view that Christ has to come first and clean up the mess, and only then can the millennium be instituted, is not an optimistic view. It's a pessimistic view. It's the view, for instance, of today's Christian right, premillennial. That is, that the world is just getting worse and worse, and it's not going to get any better till Christ comes and cleans up Washington and kicks all the bums out and captures Jerusalem and reestablishes the kingdom of God. Postmillennialism is the more optimistic view that developed even before the Enlightenment, but it was enhanced by the Enlightenment. And that is that God is working in the world to bring about progress, so that the 19th century was better than the 18th, and the 20th century would be better than the 19th. You can read magazines published in the 19th century in which articles are just absurdly optimistic and utopian. Utopianism is one of the modern results of this transforming of eschatology into progress. These magazines left you the impression that by the turn of the century, that is 1900, we probably will have gotten rid of disease by scientific progress. We would have gotten rid of war, because after all, if you get a bunch of rational people together in something like not like the United Nations, but like the League of Nations, war would be impossible. How can you have war when you have 20 or 30 very rational human beings sitting around a table talking about it? See, that's the Enlightenment optimism. What actually happened was that Woodrow Wilson, who was a post-millennialist Presbyterian, was extremely optimistic about the League of Nations, which was basically his idea. But he wasn't pessimistic enough to understand that the United States Senate and Congress would not even get us into the League of Nations. And if we weren't even in the League of Nations, how could we have any impact on whether there was going to be war or not? And the fact of the matter is, if you get 20 or 30 different nations sitting around the table, you do not have rational discourse. So that's what the League of Nations has proved. That's what the United Nations has proved. But in the 19th century, they really were optimistic about these kinds of things. So war was going to be done away with. Disease was going to be overcome by science. Poverty was going to be overcome. So what remains then? What happens when war is overcome, when poverty is overcome, when disease is overcome, when ignorance is overcome? The kingdom of God. So these post-millennial optimists of the 19th century actually used that expression. The kingdom of God is going to come into effect because of the progressive nature of evolution. This is basically even somebody like Marx has a doctrine of the kingdom of God. His is less optimistic than the 19th century liberals, but it is still utopian. Somebody had a hand up. Okay.
kind of a two-part question. Is that why, like, at the beginning of this century, the people wanted to, like, close the patent office because they thought they'd found everything, and they were so blown away by World War I? Is that?
Yeah, that's the. In fact, in the history of Christianity, World War I was the destruction of postmillennialism and the reintroduction of premillennialism. At the end of the 19th century, most Christian evangelicals, whether they were conservative or whether they were liberals or modernists, had an optimistic view of the kingdom of God. That is, that the kingdom of God would be brought about by human activity and human effort. God still had something to do with it, but it had to do as much with human effort as with anything else. So World War I simply did not fit postmillennialism. It fit premillennialism, but not postmillennialism. When all of these people got up there and got out of the trenches and went and got mowed down, and then the other side got out of the trenches and went and got mowed down, and human beings just piled up by the tons in between those trenches, there's nothing kingdom of God-ish about that. And so Christian evangelicalism lost its postmillennial tinge. Liberalism lost its postmillennial tinge. American secular liberalism is postmillennial. Let me give you an example of one of the most flagrant postmillennial political ads I ever saw. It was by Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson got on the TV and said, "The only salvation for America and for the human race is education." Well, if that's the only salvation for the human race, we're in trouble. Because our educational system has basically gone downhill since that. But education, the betterment of human beings by human effort, a utopian vision, is what motivates American liberalism. And by American liberalism, I don't just mean Democrats. In this sense, the Republicans are also American liberals. That is, they have this kind of optimistic view of what politics can do. And so each of the presidents for a long time now have had a post-millennial symbol for their campaigns. With Roosevelt, it was the New Deal. With Kennedy, it was what? The new frontier. With Clinton, it was what? The new covenant. You don't remember that? All of these are post-millennial ideas, which are saying, if you'll just elect me, the kingdom of God is going to come about. No new taxes, yeah. The older Bush's symbol was what? The New World Order. All of these, you see, are post-millennial symbols. And, of course, the new frontier never happens. The New Deal never happens the way it's supposed to happen. The new covenant did not happen the way it's supposed to happen. Because utopia means what? What does the word mean? Means no place. No place. There is no place that is utopia. And so this optimistic view that somehow or another we're going to bring about utopianism is always frustrated. Sometimes it's extremely dangerous, such as in the utopianism of Marxism and Pol Potism and other kinds of utopians. But anyway, millennialism in its post-millennial incarnation is optimistic. And basically that's what these evolutionists were in the 19th century. They were extremely optimistic. And all of a sudden they thought they got a scientific basis for justifying their optimism. And that is evolution. Evolution as progress. Well, you may understand my my collapse of a hierarchy into eschaton as progress, and you may not, and you may disagree with it. We'll probably go over it again as we go along. But nothing comes out of nowhere. And 19th century thought came out of the previous centuries of Christian thought. It just transmutes it into something else. Faith in progress replaced the doctrines of creation and providence as assurance that the universe is not really purposeless. Now that is another word that Gould and Dawkins and Hawkins hate. The idea of purpose in... There is no purpose in Darwinian evolution. Purpose is the importation of a metaphysical idea into a non-metaphysical scientific theory. In other words, if Dawkins and Gould know what they know today, and they were carried back to the 19th century in a time machine, they would be fighting more with the liberal evolutionists than they would be with the fundamentalists. Because some of the fundamentalists were the ones that were accepting Darwin's theory as a scientific theory. The liberal evolutionists were accepting it as a kind of a metaphysical theory. Neither uniform law nor accidental chance is any threat if it leads to the inevitable advance and if nature is a coherent and intelligent system. You see, all the time Darwin is getting more and more depressed as he gathers, as the implications of the scientific theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest, red in tooth and claw. Those weren't Darwin's expressions, but that's a good way to talk about Darwin's theory. As Darwin was getting more and more depressed about this, that he did not see any beneficent design in the evolution of the human being, he got so depressed that he eventually not only gave up his Christian optimism, but he gave up liberal optimism. And at the same time, though, there are these other philosophers who are just grinning from ear to ear because they have found in Darwin the scientific justification for their great optimism. The Enlightenment faith in social progress had been expanded to confidence in a progressive universe. That's one of the things I would like to sit down sometime and talk to somebody like Gould about, and that is that most of what they're blaming fundamentalists for, fundamentalists are not to blame for. The people who have put purposefulness in creation itself were the liberals of the 19th century. The people who put beneficent activity within creation itself were the liberals of the 19th century. Was this concept of progress an inference from the scientific data? That's the question. Darwin himself was evidently aware of the ambiguity at this point. He recognized that in speaking of the fittest to survive, a biologist is not rendering a moral judgment, but only referring to adaptations conferring a reproductive advantage. The fittest may be the biggest scoundrel in history. In fact, his scoundrelity, his scoundrelness, may be what made him the fittest, if you're just looking at history from the perspective of the scientific data. There's nothing in the scientific data that gives any hope for a Victorian morality, and that's the kind of morality these people wanted to preserve, was a Victorian morality. If Darwin and his supporters used progress in a way that implied a value judgment, they did so because in their heart of hearts they were Victorians. In their heart of hearts they believed that the processes of nature operated, however slowly and sporadically, to produce ever higher forms of existence. Now see, modern Darwinists don't want any truck with this idea. That humans think that they are a higher form of existence is just arrogance. How they can make a moral judgment on arrogance, I don't know. But it's arrogance for human beings to think that they are necessarily a higher form of existence. They're simply an accidental form of existence that has. And so if you're going to make any moral judgments about them, you can't get that from the scientific data. Well, that's a good point.
Is the concept of predestination arising during this period, or does it really take life of its own because of the desire to make the evolutionary perspective fit Christian thought, or is predestination something that had been going on prior to this?
No, predestination, in fact, is losing its hold over American theology, which is the reason why evolution took its place. Evolution took kind of the place of predestination. In fact, some people equated determinism, scientific determinism, with predestination. And that still occurs lots of times. Americans have become the most anti-predestinarian group of Christians in history. Paul was a predestinarian. Augustine was a predestinarian. Aquinas was a predestinarian. Luther, Calvin were predestinarians. So obviously, predestination is probably not as stupid an idea as most Americans think it is. Probably what's happening is that Americans don't understand what the doctrine of predestination was. But the liberals of the 19th century Protestant liberals were the ones who rejected predestination, starting with the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists. They rejected the Calvinist idea of predestination. And that's what made them optimistic. They also rejected the Calvinist doctrine of sin. And the Calvinist doctrine of sin and predestination go together. Now, we've opened up a can of worms when we open up the concept of predestination, but just let me tell you what I believe about this whole thing, and that is you do not know what predestination means simply if you know the word. And so what most Americans think predestination means has nothing to do with what Calvin and Luther and Aquinas and Augustine thought predestination means. Most people think predestination means a kind of a determinism. But determinism is a philosophical concept. Predestination is a theological concept. Determinism is a kind of a scientific fatalism. Predestination is not a theological fatalism. Predestination is primarily a doctrine to give assurance to people that they are being taken care of by God. Now, I'll just leave it at that right now. As naturalists, the Darwinians tried to define improvement, fitness, and the like in biological terms. But their use of the terms was subtly colored by the indomitable optimism of their age. In other words, they weren't evolutionists because of Darwin. They were evolutionists because they were Victorians. The 19th century believed in progress, but it was not very careful to define what it meant by progress. Just like I say, we're not careful to define what we mean by predestination. And so we might have a very negative view on it or a very positive view on it. But if we have a negative view or a positive view on something we don't know what it is, then what good are those views? All right, the same thing is true in terms of progress. They weren't careful to define what progress meant. And that's another thing that modern Darwinians want to completely erase from any Darwinian theory of evolution, is the idea of progress. The problem of the relationship of ethical norms to evolution is significant if conscious human choice now influences future evolution. And also the other way around, which is being more dealt with at the present through evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. Conscious human choice influences future evolution. That's what evolutionists like Desjardins tried to emphasize. But other evolutionists like E.O. Wilson and other people today are emphasizing how that evolution has actually determined what we call morals. The belief that competition promotes progress fitted in well with the individualistic social philosophy common in this period. In other words, it fitted very well with Adam Smith. It did not fit very well with John Calvin. Because John Calvin didn't believe that competition produced progress. Competition was of the kind that human beings are usually engaged in, can be more readily described as sin rather than progress. So hyper-individualism also comes out of this liberal Enlightenment concept of progress. Biological and political ideas merged in what has been called social Darwinism. Now, there are lots of problems in the moral sphere with all of these thinkers in the 19th century, at least from the perspective of modern politically correct moralists. For instance, Darwin was a scientific racist, and so were most of the Darwinists at the period. And so were Darwinists up until it has become, so were many Darwinists upward until it has become politically incorrect to be scientific racist. Now, what's the difference between a scientific racist and another kind of racist? What?
They twist data to support their hypothesis?
They believe that the data supports it. In other words, if you as a Victorian, or at least a pre-Victorian, considered, for instance, Africans to be inferior as human beings, you already believed that before Darwin's theory of evolution. But when Darwin's theory of evolution comes on the scene, it immediately gives some people the idea that we now have scientific data for that. After all, if human beings are the result of an inevitable development that comes by chance and is not guided by morality, then on what basis can you decide that all races are of equal value? Well, that's not the basis upon which Christianity decides whether somebody is of equal value, is on the basis of scientific data. That's not the way Christianity decides whether individuals are of equal value. For instance, the scientific data may tell a scientist that my IQ is 95 and yours is 160. And a scientific racist would therefore judge who to be the fittest. The guy with the 160. So I kind of fall short. But in American courts, we're operating, in American law, we operate under the myth of equality. That is, we all know that we have differences in IQ. We all know that we have differences in height and weight and strength and all kinds of things. But we still operate on the basis of the myth that before the law we're equal. And that myth is based on the theological assumption that Thomas Jefferson posited in the Declaration of Independence. And what is that? We hold these truths to be, go ahead. Punch your button.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
That's right. That is not a scientific statement. Even Jefferson knew that wasn't a scientific statement. But you know, there's a great deal of problem today with even discussing that subject. what the scientific data says about the quality of human beings. Because the quality of human beings is not based on scientific data. It has never been based on scientific data. It's based on the theological assumption that all human beings, whatever their IQ, whatever their culture, whatever their level of whatever it is, they are equal before God because they've been created equal. So it's a theological fiction, you might say, that it's a theological doctrine that has been converted into a legal fiction. But it is a scientific doctrine that can't even be discussed. And that's probably politically good, because if it were being discussed, then there would be scientific racists today who would use that as a basis for misusing different races because they're different intelligence. And that wouldn't be good for Anglos in America, because Anglos are not top on the list of IQ tests in America. Orientals are. So based on scientific racism, America should be white people should be second-class citizens in America. So I'm kind of glad that Jefferson believed in this theological notion that all humans are created equal. And he was intelligent enough to know that men, when he used men, he was talking about women too. That's a non-starter if you're trying to interpret Jefferson. So, social Darwinism is the result of this combination of Victorian liberalism, Victorian ideas of progress, and the scientific theory of evolution. An illegitimate convergence, an illogical convergence, a theologically unsatisfactory convergence. Thomas Huxley. Now, Thomas is one of my favorite people from the 19th century. And a lot of people wonder why he would be one of my favorite people. Because he was an honest man, and he was also a very good logical thinker. And he held that valid ethical norms cannot be derived from evolution. And the reason why he held that is because he wasn't quite as tainted by leftovers from Christian eschatology as the other evolutionists were. He's the one, who invented the term agnostic, because he didn't know what to call himself, and he didn't want to spend a whole paragraph describing himself, so he introduced the term agnostic. Because he knew he wasn't an atheist, he was too logical to be an atheist, because being an atheist implies what? That you know there's no God. Huxley knew better than that. You can't know there's no God. You may not be able to know there is one, but you also can't know there isn't one. So he preferred agnosticism. But and he also was better acquainted with biblical scholarship and with Christian theology than Darwin was. So he was a generally overall competent person to be involved in this debate. And one of the things that bothered him the most was these evolutionists who thought that they could get morality, namely social Darwinism, out of the scientific doctrine of evolution. Let's understand once for all that the ethical progress of society depends not on imitating the cosmic process. He doesn't want to live in a society that imitates Darwinian evolution as a societal morality. He doesn't want to live there. And most of us wouldn't want to live there. Most of us would not want to live under a social Darwinist regime. though in a sense we do, because social Darwinism is still one of the definite inputs into modern political thought. So we do not want to imitate it, still less in running away from it, but in combating it. He doesn't want to cover it up, that you can't get morality out of the scientific theory of evolution. He wants to combat evolution, because he's a good Victorian moralist. He doesn't believe in murder. He doesn't believe in war crimes. He doesn't believe in torture. He doesn't believe that one group of human beings can be mistreated. He doesn't believe that human beings can be exploited for the expense of other people, at the expense of, or that people can make social gains at the expense of exploiting other people. Sounds like a good moralist. But in order to justify his morality, he has to argue that he did not get his morality from the scientific theory of evolution, and he doesn't want you to, because he doesn't want you to live next door to him if you get your morality from evolution. The practice of that which is ethically best, that is what we call goodness or virtue, involves a course of conduct which in all respects is opposed to that which leads to success in the cosmic struggle for existence. Now, of course, in the modern study of evolutionary ethics, or evolutionary morality, or evolutionary psychology, Huxley would be an extremely naive participant from the perspective of the evolutionary psychologist. But whether he's naive or not, we need to understand what his position was. In place of ruthless self-assertion, it, that is, human morality, demands self-restraint. In place of thrusting aside or treading down all competitors, it requires that the individual shall not merely respect, but shall help his fellows. Its influence is directed not so much to the survival of the fittest as to the fitting of as many as possible to survive. Now contrast that. Let's finish it. It repudiates the gladiatorial theory of existence. But this sentence is very significant because in this, Thomas Huxley and William Jennings Bryan agreed totally, except one believed in the scientific theory of evolution and the other one didn't, because the one who didn't was reading the theories of evolution that were coming from these social Darwinists. Its influence is directed not so much to the survival of the fittest as to the fitting of as many as possible to survive. Now recall a bit of history that Huxley did not know about, because he died long before it. Recall a bit of history in which Darwin's theory was applied to society in Germany. Where there was no such thing as fitting of as many as possible to survive. So you see, Thomas Huxley was as aware as William Jennings Bryan later was aware that if you use the Darwinian theory of evolution as a societal morality, you were in trouble as a society. That's exactly what Darwin's wife believed. And that's the reason why she didn't want him to publish. So this problem doesn't evaporate just because we now know more scientifically about the theory of evolution. That problem is still there. How do you relate the the morals of society to scientific data. In the 19th century, there were diverging currents in theology. There were traditional responses to evolution, that is, responses from the perspective of traditional Christian theism. And then there was the modernist movement. Every age considers itself to be modern, and these folks did not mind at all calling themselves modernists, just like their opponents that developed did not mind at all calling themselves fundamentalists. But these days, nobody wants to be called a modernist in theology, and nobody wants to be called a fundamentalist because the words became so pejorative. But we still have to understand how these movements began and how they developed. Then there's the rise of liberal theology, which is different from the modernist movement, though it fades off each fades off into the other. In other words, there's some thinkers that you can't really separate as liberals versus modernists, and vice versa. And then there are the naturalistic philosophies of evolution. The traditional responses to evolution, conflict was experienced by some adherents of traditionalism and naturalism, but many other options were also explored. Moreover, debates about evolution were occurring within the scientific community, which further undermines the metaphor of warfare between two united armies arrayed against each other. We talked about that extensively in the first couple of weeks. The myth that there was a warfare between science and religion is a myth. It never occurred in history. There were a great many very complicated struggles among scientists and among Christians about how the Bible was to be interpreted in the light of modern science. But there was only one agnostic in the whole fight, and that was Thomas Huxley in the beginning. Among conservative Protestants, there was considerable reluctance to acknowledge either evolution or historical scholarship on the Bible. Thomas Huxley was under the impression that even though he was an agnostic, that if more Christians were aware of the results of historical scholarship, they would be much more inclined or be more open to an understanding of scientific evolution. In fact, let me read a statement that he made one time to Charles Kingsley, who was one of the first great liberal Anglican theologians. Charles Darwin, you remember, kind of lost his faith under the impact of the death of his daughter. Thomas Huxley, on the other hand, had already lost his faith before the death of his son. But the death of his son brought him up short, so that he even started talking like he was almost a Christian. So these two people kind of had opposite reactions to the death of their children. But anyway, after the funeral of his son, which Charles Kingsley was involved in the funeral, he tells Kingsley in a very emotional conversation, "If that great and powerful instrument for good and evil, the Church of England, is to be saved from being shivered into fragments by the advancing tide of science, an event I should be sorry to witness, but which will infallibly occur if men like Samuel of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, are to have the guidance of her destinies. It must be by the efforts of men who, like yourself," now again he's talking to a liberal minister, "who, like yourself, see your way to the combination of the practice of the church with the spirit of science. Understand that all the younger men of science whom I know intimately are essentially of my way of thinking." That's probably a little bit of an exaggeration. "But," he says, "I know not a scoffer or an irreligious or an immoral man among them, except me. But they all regard orthodoxy as the problem. They all regard orthodoxy as you regard Brahmanism, which is what? Hinduism. So what he's telling Charles Kingsley is, you know how you still have a little problem with Hinduism as a satisfactory theology. The young men that I have to do with are religious men. They're members of the Church of England. They're not irreligious. They're not scoffers at the faith. But they believe that orthodoxy has to change to accommodate the spirit of science, as he calls it. Understand that this new school of prophets is the only one that can work miracles. That it is right, and you will comprehend that it is of no use to try to barricade us from the shovel hats and aprons and to talk about our doctrines being shocking. So of all the scientists and all the preachers of his day, Thomas Huxley comes closest to being kind of an evangelist. He is trying to shock, but he wants people in the Church of England not to be shocked, but instead to accommodate themselves so that the Church of England, which he says he would be very sorry to see disintegrate, can survive. Charles Darwin himself, in some letters that he had written to Asa Gray, who was the Calvinist, Congregationalist theologian at Harvard, scientist who accepted the theory of evolution, he made this statement after some of his correspondence. It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. You are right about Kingsley, the man that we just mentioned. Asa Gray, the eminent botanist, is another case in point. What my own views may be is a question of no consequence to anyone except myself. But as you ask, I may state that my judgment often fluctuates. Moreover, whether a man deserves to be called a theist depends upon the definition of the term. And that was one of Darwin's problems, that he did not really study theological definitions very much, which is much too large a subject for a note. In my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist, in the sense of denying the existence of a God. I think that generally, and more as I grow older, but not always, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. So Thomas Huxley had provided the language by which Darwin was to more and more describe himself. But he never, in his fluctuations, he said, came to the position that there was not a God. But he did come to the position that there was not a God that he could know anything about. And that's because, and this is going to be very important in the rest of this discussion, Huxley, the most important orthodox doctrine that Huxley objected to was the doctrine of revelation, because that was the most important Christian doctrine that the Enlightenment objected to. And that's the most important doctrine that the modernists objected to, the idea of revelation. If you don't have a doctrine of revelation, and if you can't learn anything from God, about God from science, then you've got nothing. Agnosticism is the best word. Most such groups eventually made at least some adjustments to both. That is, even conservative Protestants eventually made some adjustment to both historical scholarship, biblical scholarship, and evolution. And we'll talk about some of those folks later. There were other Protestants, however, who combined an orthodox theology with an acceptance of evolution. And these included Asa Gray, for instance. He was a Congregationalist with a moderate Calvinist view. Among theologians, James McCosh, president of Princeton University, and an influential Presbyterian, suggested that God not only established the initial design of the whole evolutionary process, but continues to work through what appears to us to be spontaneous changes. The word appearance is very important even in the modern discussion, because the design people, one of the things the design people like to do is to quote Weinberg, Dawkins, Hawkins, because all of these people say something like, it appears as though the world is designed. But then in the next sentence, what did they say? But of course it's not. So the design people say, well, maybe the reason why it appears that it's designed is that it's designed. So that's the argument now going on between the design people and the anti-design people. The chance variations, for which Darwin could give no explanation, may have been caused by the supernatural choices of an intervening designer who directs apparently accidental variations to effect particular purposes. Evolution was the way in which the creativity of God was expressed in time. Now, this is the Protestant liberal approach to evolution in the 19th century, and this is at Princeton University. And Princeton University produced both the liberals and the fundamentalists of the early part of the 20th century. So it was kind of ground zero on the evolution controversy. The greatest liberal Protestant theologians and the greatest fundamentalist Protestant theologians were all teachers at Princeton. And so liberals and fundamentalists, since they're connected with Princeton, are also connected with the Presbyterian Church. So the Presbyterian Church produced both the more important liberals and the more important fundamentalists in this controversy. Evolution was the way, according to McCosh, in which the creative activity of God was expressed in time. Now, Dawkins, Gould, and other folks think that McCosh is meddling where he shouldn't meddle. If he's a theologian, he shouldn't even suggest that there is any design in the universe. He certainly shouldn't suggest that there are any supernatural interferences with what we know about science. So he wouldn't get along any better with modern Darwinists than fundamentalists do. But this is the way in which liberal Protestantism went, the McCosh way. That's the reason why most Americans who are descendants of these evangelical liberal Protestants have no problem whatever in thinking that God acted through evolution to produce human beings. Gould and Dawkins don't want them to think that way, but Gould and Dawkins have no choice in the matter because these represent the majority of Americans. James Moore, who wrote one of the best books ever written on Victorian acceptance of Darwinianism, called The Post-Darwinian Controversies, and it's out of print. And if you ever get a chance to find a book like that, I would also like to buy it from you. The Post-Darwinian Controversies. Because he discusses in this book the position of just about all of the important 19th century theologians, conservative, fundamentalist, liberal, modernists. But he points out that some Calvinists, such as Gray and McCosh, in fact that's the book he points this out in, agreed with Darwin in emphasizing natural selection. They differed from the modernists, who were strong advocates of evolution, but usually favored Lamarckian alternatives and defended Spencer's optimism concerning the inevitable progress. Now get the picture in your brain. When the evolutionary controversy is going on, who are Darwin's best friends? They're the Christian theologians of Harvard and Princeton. Who think they are Darwin's best friends, but they're not. They are the modernist and evolutionary philosophers of England and America. So this, the myth that we have about how this controversy took place is just not historically verifiable. They differed from modernists in that they were more Darwinian than the modernists were, these Christian theologians. More suggests that Calvinists who believed in God's sovereignty, now I've suggested this several times in several different ways, but here's more suggestion. More suggests that Calvinists who believed in God's sovereignty could more readily accept natural selection as a lawful process. Providence and predestination were said to act through the laws of nature. All events occur according to God's will. Now this is more of an eschatological view than the modernist view of pantheism. This is an eschatological view that when you watch nature, you're seeing natural selection, you're seeing chance variations, you're seeing all of these things that Darwin said. But somewhere up there is still God, and God still is sovereign. And whatever scientists discover about how nature works does not take away from the fact that God is still sovereign. Now that's the Calvinists. That's the reason why the Calvinists were able to accept Darwin a little bit more literally than the more liberal people, the modernist people. Conservative responses in the decades following Darwin should be distinguished from the later American movement known as fundamentalism. You can call these people proto-fundamentalists, but they would not have objected to being called fundamentalists because the word fundamentalist did not have such pejorative connotations at the time. But these were Princeton philosophers like Machen, M-A-C-H-E-N, who were as educated as any of the liberals. But they did disagree with the liberals on certain fundamental doctrines. For instance, they disagreed with the liberals about the status of miracles. Could there be miracles? They understood miracles as not being contrary to a lawful nature if you have a sovereign God. If you don't have a sovereign God, then there can't be any such thing as miracles. But if you have a sovereign God, they say, then you can imagine the universe being lawful and going according to scientific laws, and you can also imagine that God is still sovereign. The name fundamentalism originated in a series of pamphlets entitled The Fundamentals, starting in 1909. And I have, I guess, 4, 5, or 6 of these original fundamentals. And there are 3 articles in these fundamentals on evolution. One written by George Frederick Wright, who was a strict Calvinist. It was pro-evolution. Another written by a man that I can't think his name of, and then the third one was written by William Jennings Bryan. So out of the 3 articles in this book, The Fundamentals, one was anti-evolution, the other were conciliatory. And that's in the Fundamentals, after which fundamentalism was named. So we'll talk some more about these next time. The Fundamentals were a conscious and defensive reaction against the modernism that seemed to have sacrificed all distinctive Christian beliefs in accommodation to evolutionary philosophies. The modernists not only accepted evolution, but they denied the resurrection of Jesus. And fundamentalists simply say, well, you can accept evolution, but when you deny the resurrection of Jesus, you're denying the basic doctrine of the Christian faith. So that's why they're called fundamentalists. They want to go back and reserve and preserve the fundamentals from the modernists who don't care whether these ideas are preserved or not. And when you come to the fundamentalists, you're coming to the ancestors of scientific creationism, even though they themselves were not scientific creationists. Okay.